Can you be too independent, and is that linked to trauma? The answer to both of those questions is yes. So in this video, we're going to go through signs that you might be hyper-independent, how hyper-independence comes about to begin with, the impact that it has on your relationship with yourself and other people, and steps to move forward. But first, if you're new here, my name is Simone Saunders and I'm a licensed therapist in Calgary, Alberta. I upload weekly to this channel, so hit that subscribe button and that like button and let's get started. So typically when we think about independence, we think of it as a good thing, and it is a good thing. But what also can be true is that when we're too independent, it can leave us feeling isolated. So you're probably wondering, how does hyper-independence differ from independence? So with hyper-independence, there's a drive to need no one and a fear of depending on other people. And typically this stems from not being able to rely on the people closest to them. So if you struggle with hyper-independence, here's 6 things that you might notice about yourself. Number 1, you dislike needy people. Number 2, it's very hard for you to ask for help, and there's a fear of feeling burdensome to other people. Number 3, you have a hard time with vulnerability. Number 4, you're typically very hard to get to know, especially on a deep level. Number 5, you're an overachiever, whether that's career-wise or socially or in some other pursuit. And number 6, you're typically the strong friend. Now, if you're related to any of those, it's probably a sign that you should keep watching. While those who are hyper-independent typically are very attached to that sense of themselves, what's also true is that hyper-independent people typically experience extreme loneliness, self-criticism, or relationships that lack a lot of emotional intimacy. So let's talk about where hyper-independence comes from and how it's related to trauma. Often when hyper-independence develops as a coping mechanism, it's developed because there's a lack of ability to rely on those that are closest to you, and typically that means your caregivers. I've touched briefly on emotional neglect and parentification in a previous video, which I'll link. But those are often the 2 main experiences that lead to hyper-independence as a coping mechanism. So when we look at emotional neglect, that happens when a parent doesn't respond enough to a child's emotional needs during the brain development period. And brain development doesn't just stop at childhood, it goes well on to your teenage and adult years. So emotional neglect might look like a lack of structure in the home, lack of emotional attunement to the child, lack of boundaries, lack of encouragement, parents who are just overly busy and can't see their child in the way that their child needs to be seen, children not getting the life skills that they need in order to navigate the world, and experiences that don't allow the child to develop and experience their identity. So when emotional neglect is experienced, there's decreased levels of oxytocin in the brain, often a feeling of alienation or defectiveness, social impairment, detachment from emotion, and often consistent feelings of shame. From the perspective of emotional neglect, the child learns that their emotional needs will not be met unless they meet them themselves. So in essence, everybody else is unreliable and they can only rely on themselves. If we take a look at parentification, which is when children assume responsibilities that are developmentally inappropriate, like being a mediator for the family, being involved in financial decisions, raising your siblings, being an emotional confidant for any of your caregivers, having household responsibilities that aren't appropriate for your age. This inherently teaches the child that stability and safety cannot be consistently provided by the caregivers. Therefore, when they step into these roles that are developmentally inappropriate, they rely on themselves and take that coping mechanism all the way into adulthood. Both of these experiences trigger nervous system activation, which then turns into toxic stress, thus being traumatic for that child. When we take a look at the impact on relationships, whether that be with yourself or other people, the impact is large. We are all human, which means that we're built for connection and built to live in community with other people. But when we're taught consistently that that isn't safe, we self-isolate. At some point, the load becomes too hard to carry, and people typically go into overfunctioning or underfunctioning. Overfunctioning, where people overwork themselves into burnout and emotional exhaustion, or underfunctioning, when your nervous system activates the freeze response and it's difficult to do things of daily living like getting out of bed, brushing your teeth, making meals for yourself. And oftentimes people can oscillate between overfunctioning and underfunctioning. There's a large level of shame with people who struggle with hyperindependence, because on one hand there's an innate need and want for emotional connection, and on the other hand there's a fear of it. So in relationships, whether that be intimate or platonic, emotional intimacy can be difficult to form. Things might often feel surface level. People might complain that they can't get close to you. You might not see the value in community and relationships because you've never allowed yourself to rely on other people. Some other experiences that you might notice as someone who's hyper-independent is feelings of depression and not knowing why, long-standing wishes to run away or not exist, and you might remember your childhood as lonely, even if it was happy. Steps for moving forward. I always tell my clients that in order to move forward, you have to start getting comfortable with being uncomfortable. And that's exactly what this process is going to look like. In order to move away from hyper-independence, what's needed is emotional vulnerability, relying on others, and taking a look into the shame. One of my biggest recommendations is this book by Johnny Swebb, and it's called Running on Empty, and it's about emotional neglect. And while the entire book isn't on hyperindependence, there is a section on it, and it does give very helpful information and insight. But if you're looking for ways to start now to move away from hyperindependence, start with this. Reflect on your relationships. Are there those that you feel safer with than others, more emotionally close than others? What attributes do those relationships have that make you feel more safe and have the ability to move closer? How can you start allowing yourself to rely on other people in small ways that feel a little bit less threatening? Maybe that's allowing someone to take you for coffee. Maybe that's asking someone for their opinion. Perhaps that's utilizing your closest relationship and intentionally sharing something that's vulnerable so that you can get used to the feelings of support gradually. Something that's important to remember is that it's not going to feel good initially. Because you are so used to doing things on your own and doing them your way, there will be an adjustment period where you feel massive discomfort accepting support and asking for support. Know that that space is temporary. And my biggest recommendation of them all is journaling. It's helpful to keep track of your mindset, the things that you are comfortable with and not comfortable with on a day-to-day, week-to-week, or whatever schedule that works for you. Because progress tends to be gradual. And when we're able to go back over time and look at the things that made us feel comfortable or uncomfortable, that's when we can see if there's been vertical movement. If you have any questions, drop them down below and I'll be sure to answer as many as I can. If you have any recommendations for what you would like to see next, drop that below as well. Hit that subscribe button and I will see you in the next video.